This is a bit different from my normal videos. I had intended it to be one of those, instructional videos. But as time went on, it became more apparent that if anyone followed my methods, they would probably end up in the same mess I did. So perhaps I was not the best person to advise others. In fact, I began to wonder if I should bother with a video at all. But I did. So instead, this is a cautionary tale of how I did it and the mistakes that I made along the way. So watch the video and possibly learn how to avoid the errors I made when you decide to ballast your layout. Okay, ballasting is one of those areas that you can't help noticing on a finished layout. If it's done well, it looks great, but if not, it can spoil the layout completely. Also, once the ballast is laid, it's very difficult to remove. So I was approaching the task with more than a little trepidation. I read up a lot on how to do it and watched several YouTube videos, so I felt I was ready as I ever would be. I assembled all the necessary tools and equipment, as you can see, and even treated myself to a new ballast spreader. I decided to start on a small section of plain double track about 2 feet long, and then, if everything worked okay, to progress to the rest of the layout. It is probably me, but I found that using the ballast spreader was not as easy as it looked. There is a slider in the base which you close to load ballast into the spreader and open it once you wish to start spreading. Simple, eh? I found I was easily confused as to which way was closed and which way was open, and so initially ended up with piles of ballast where I didn't want them and no ballast where I did. In places I had used old Hornby track, and the ballast spreader did not like sliding smoothly over the large moulded chairs on the sleepers, but instead bumped over them. This led to more piles of ballast where I didn't want them. I had also reckoned without the fact that it would not slide over places where I had soldered track feed wires, so yes, more small piles of ballast. Later on, I also found that the spreader could not be used at all on point work. Yes, I know it's obvious really. But apart from these issues, the ballast spreader worked well. Anyway, a little while later the ballast was down, a little untidy at this time, but at least it was down. Then the fun part, tapping the rails with the handle of the paintbrush to ensure the ballast went down snugly between the sleepers. Followed by a little light hoovering to remove any surplus ballast. Of course, being careful not to remove too much. I put a piece of kitchen towel over the end of the hoover tube to reduce the suction as much as possible, and also to enable me to reclaim the ballast for future use. Any gaps in the ballast were filled and smoothed into shape using my fingers, and the remaining stray ballast was removed using a large paintbrush. Then, more tapping with the paintbrush handle, more smoothing with the fingers, and more brushing away of stray ballast until finally the pre-glued ballast was in place and looked pretty good. Encouraged by my success so far, I pressed on and commenced the gluing stage. The first step was to gently mist the whole section with water with a couple of drops of washing up liquid in it. The idea is to gently dampen the dry and dusty ballast ready for the gluing stage, and I may have overdone this. The second step was to liberally apply a 50-50 mix of water and PVA glue using a large syringe. I may have overdone this stage as well. Looking at the shots just after these stages were completed shows I may have been rather overgenerous with the water, and I think this is partly what caused problems later on. But I had seen YouTube videos with similar amounts of water used, so I was not unduly worried. I may not be much of a modeller, but I am an optimist. Hopefully it will all dry out nicely. I resisted the temptation to prod the ballast at this stage and left it to set for a couple of days. I should point out that the layout is situated in an unheated garage and the ballast was initially started in November, so perhaps it was a bit much to expect it all to set in a couple of days. I did say I'm an optimist. 2 days later it hadn't even started to set. But I was not bothered, as I was just going away on a week's holiday, and so it could set whilst I was away, and I could then work on it on my return. Unfortunately, when I returned, the ballast was not as solid as I would have liked, and large parts of it hadn't set at all, and the ballast on these sections had to be removed. However, spurred on by my lack of success with the first section, I decided to throw caution to the winds and ballast the rest of the layout using exactly the same methods as before. I think this may have been a mistake. I did mask off the point work, however, to stop any glue getting on the point blades, and points were ballasted carefully by hand using a teaspoon to put the ballast in place. For a bit of variety, and because I thought it was a good idea at the time, I decided to ballast the areas between the tracks using a mixture of grey and brown ballast. This did not give the effect I was after, but at least it could be spray painted afterwards along with the rest of the track. The siding behind the station and the loco shed road were ballasted with brown ballast, as I thought these areas would be dirtier in real life. But again, this didn't achieve the effect I was after. Oh dear. More painting. I thought the completed, in inverted commas, ballast looked quite nice, but far too bright. It looked very light grey looking one way along the layout, but almost brown when looking the other way. I thought this might somehow have been poor workmanship on my part, but soon realised it was because the garage only has a window in one end, which gave this effect. With all the ballast glued down, I sprayed the whole lot with a brown track colour, using more black on the loco shed road and in the station where locos would stand. I think I rather overdid the spraying, as it all ended up looking rather darker than I intended. So, a few days later, now that all was done, I tested the ballast to see if it had set, and was dismayed, but not altogether surprised, that there were a number of areas where it had not stuck very well. A lot of it could simply be removed by gently rubbing my fingers along the ballast, which was not what I wanted. Even putting stock on the track for testing purposes resulted in some ballast coming away and the light grey colour showing through the dark brown paint finish. Oh good, I thought. Now I will have to re-glue the offending areas. However, the more I thought about it, and the more I tested the ballast, it seemed that the best course of action was to re-glue the ballast on the whole layout. So that's what I did. More diluted glue applied by syringe to ballast and a baseboard that had yet to dry out from the first soaking was possibly not my brightest idea, but I couldn't think of anything better, and so I did it anyway. Areas where the ballast had come away completely were refilled and re-glued. These areas were brush painted to match in with the existing colours, but even this was not as easy as it should have been, as surface tension on the new ballast meant that the paint went anywhere but where it was supposed to. I left all of this to dry and set, and after a few more weeks everything was okay and nice and solid. Success! It was all finished. Wrong. Needless to say, my delight was short-lived, because a little while later I noticed that all over the board and the ballast green mould had started to appear. Everything had been soaked too many times, and this was the result. I briefly thought about modelling a weed-killing train and pretending that it had broken down and was out of service, but reality soon kicked in, followed by a reasonable amount of panic. I didn't want mould growing up through the ballast. I googled all sorts of advice on how to get rid of mould, but strangely none of the answers contained anything about removing it from model railway ballast. I dampened a cloth, not too damp, we've had enough water already, and gently dabbed it away, but how to stop it coming back again? Finally, my brain started working and I moved a convector heater into the garage. Something I obviously should have done a long while ago, and something which would have saved me a lot of work and heartache. A few days later, there was no reoccurrence of mould, the baseboard was dry, the ballast had dried to a nice hard solid finish, and all seemed tickety-boo. Well, needless to say, not quite. The softboard had shrunk slightly during the wetting and drying processes, and revealed that what I had previously thought was one sheet of 6x4 was in fact 2 sheets of 3x4, and I now had a small crack right through the middle of the layout. Oh good. So what have I learnt? As I guessed before the start, ballasting is not easy, either laying it, fettling it or gluing it. But most obviously, don't try and lay ballast in a cold, damp environment. Do it during a warm and dry time of the year, or if not, use a heater. Even on a low setting, it's much better for the ballasting process. Oh, and yes, it's much nicer for you too. Is the ballasting finished? Well, not quite. As you can see, there are still some white specks that need a dab of paint, and I have just found a couple of small areas which need some more filling and painting. But once that is done, it'll have to do. I've had enough of ballasting for the time being, and can understand why, when I built the original layout, I used foam ballast, as it is so much easier to apply. The whole ballasting exercise has taken me something like 3 months to get to this stage, but as most of that time was waiting for it to dry, I was at least able to concentrate on constructing buildings ready for the day when I can actually start operating the layout. That's all for now. See you next time.